Hey everyone, Pastor Ryan here. The Lord be with you. It's my privilege today to continue a Sabbath video series that we're doing here. Began last week with Travis West, who gave us a biblical creational perspective on what the Sabbath is. And if you haven't seen that, I want to encourage you to go back and watch that one. We're going to link to it in the description. But for those of you that have, just a couple of points or a few points as we build on the work that Travis gave to us last time. He mentioned three things that I want us to hold close as we continue in this video. The first is that Sabbath gives us a new way to think about time, where for so many of us in the postmodern West, we just have a time that follows along like a line, like it just moves and continues day after day after day and just follows along like a flat line. Travis gave us the image of biblical time like a flower, almost like there is a center, that center, like the center of a black-eyed Susan, Travis said, is Sabbath. And then if we were to follow along with a pedal moving away from the center, we would find ourselves curving around only to head back to that center again. That Sabbath offers us a grounding and a source of the way in which time works in our lives. So that's the first thing. Think about time like we think about a black-eyed Susan, like a flower with its center and its petals. The second thing is that Sabbath is, in the biblical understanding, creational perspective, Sabbath means to cease and then to rest and to rest. And this ceasing and this resting isn't separate from the creative process or the created order. It's not outside of, it's not ceasing from creation. It's actually built into the network of creation. We might say that the idea of rest and of ceasing is just as much in our bones and in the soil of creation as any other part of the cosmos. So that's the second thing. The third thing is that Sabbath gives us a new way to think about the story of God that we're being invited into. We know that there's a bunch of destructive stories that are stories of the ego, right? Henry Nouwen calls these kinds of stories the three lies. He says, the three lies of identity are, I am what I have, I am what I do, or I am what others say about me. These stories that we tell ourselves or get told to us by a culture writ large are stories that can get in the way of the story of God, of who we are as children of God, who we are as followers of Jesus. These stories can detract us and distract us from who we are called and invited to be by our living God. So, those 3 points are what Travis talked about last time, and I want to build on them this time. In particular, the idea of God's story and us being invited into God's story. Because those 3 lies that Henry Nouwen tells us about, the I am what I have, I am what I do, or I am what others say about me, are stories that feature really prominent in our lives. In particular, this one of I am what I do. So today we're going to talk about work a little bit. I would have said that we have a problem with work long before we arrived at our present moment of a global pandemic of COVID-19. We love to work hard as a Western nation. We love to think that we can outwork anyone else, that our days can be longer, that we can do more and be more efficient, and we can achieve and succeed more than anybody else. And believe me, hard work isn't a bad thing necessarily. Working hard and being passionate about what you do is definitely something that is given to us as a gift by God. And yet, when we take that passion for work or to an unhealthy extreme where we find our lives getting out of balance because all we do is that work. All we do is that passion, and we never stop, or we never attend to the other parts of life, or we let life float on past us because we're so busy with that one thing. Then that is an imbalance that's not healthy. Sabbath, like Travis talked about with the flower, gives us that center to come back to and reorient ourselves. But now we have this global pandemic, and we are thinking about work in a brand new way. For some of us, we have been deemed essential, and for others, we've been deemed non-essential as far as work. Now, that's an odd way to think about work, I think, and problematic. Isn't all of our work essential if we love and care for it and our job is furloughed? Isn't it hard to think that somehow our work isn't considered essential? Maybe that's a problematic aside, but for essential workers, let's just talk about a couple of things, because essential workers and non-essential workers have some different things going on with Sabbath, and yet we have the same challenges and invitation at the end of them. I'll get there in a minute. First, let's talk about these essential folks. These essential folks who are doing incredible work. We've been talking about doctors and nurses like they're heroes, and you know what? They are doing heroic work right now, and they are on the front lines of helping people with this terrible disease, and sometimes working overtime or more time than they feel like their body can even give. They're exhausted, they're burned out. One shift has bled over into another shift. When will they see their rest, their break? Because there just seems to always be more sick people to attend to. And not only that, but these same doctors, nurses, hospital staff, administrators that work in this public health sector, these people are also sometimes the only faces and the only voices that can accompany these folks in quarantine as they have to say goodbye to loved ones. Nurses hold phones for patients so they can call spouses, children, parents, siblings. This kind of work takes an emotional toll that no one can or should keep up without a break, without rest, without ceasing. My wife and I have a friend who isn't essential in the sense that she is a doctor or nurse, but she works at a grocery store. And she is someone who is exposed by other people needing to go out and do essential things for their own families, for their own selves. Get bread and milk and eggs and toilet paper, and they come to her checkout line. Shift after shift, they walk by her and interact with her. But she's someone that is also considered high risk. But she can't say no to a shift. Her economic situation doesn't allow it. So she's deemed essential, and all the shifts stack up. And not only that, but on top of the physical demands of working all of these shifts, she is also asked to carry the mental and emotional weight of what might happen if she gets sick. These folks who are essential workers are being asked to do a lot. And sometimes that what we are asking as a society from these people might be too much if we also aren't giving them the space to cease and to rest. So those are the essential folks. Set them aside for just a second. Let's talk about other non-essential folks, as problematic as that is, since we've all agreed to these terms culturally in the right now. For us non-essential folks, maybe you are somebody that's had to say goodbye to a job or been furloughed, who's unemployed or underemployed. Maybe you're someone of privilege like me. I somehow get to have a job and work from home, and nothing really changes in the demands of my job. And yet everything has changed in how my job is executed. But I'm fortunate, I get to keep my job and in this time. So for the underemployed, the unemployed, or the stay-at-home, working at home, we have a bit of a different set of questions. I don't know about you, but I brought a stack of books home with me thinking, now I'll have the time to tackle all these novels and all of these commentaries on Scripture that I've been just itching to get to. But it hasn't exactly happened that way, because emails and phone calls keep coming. I have to have Zoom meetings. I had to figure out how to download Zoom and figure out what that was even all about, and then get used to doing Bible studies or council meetings over those kinds of things. Maybe you've had to do this kind of thing too. Get used to a Zoom reality. But because I'm home and others are home, we're all somewhat more available. And so the calls are easier to take. The emails are easier to answer. And the family and work balance that I had or others had is now commingled. It's not separate spaces anymore. More than that, my attitude, or the attitude of that I talk to others as parishioners in the church that I pastor at, we all thought that this would feel like a break. People bought gallons of paint before this started and said, I'm going to get all of these projects done. It's going to be so nice to rest. It's going to be so nice to just be at home for a while. But what happens when the Sabbath that we think we need is suddenly thrust upon us and doesn't last a day, but is now going into its third month? Are we really resting? See, one of the insidious lies about all this is that being at home means rest, and rest means or equals being at home, but it doesn't necessarily. We still have demands. We still have things that need to get done. Maybe we haven't really actually allowed ourselves to think about time any differently, and we're just so used to that flat line and just moving forward that day after day after day has just bled into each other, and we can no longer wake up and know discerningly what day it is without looking at our iPhone. What day is it even anymore? If we're used to that flat line of time, it can feel exactly like that. It's a disorienting thing. And that's what these essential or non-essential folks all have in common, is that this pandemic has disoriented us. It's disoriented our sense of time. Actually, maybe it's more like it exposed us. For we weren't thinking about time in the way that God has invited us to think about time. Instead of this flower image with something holding us at its center, we have just been going along that flat line of time, just letting the day follow after a day. There is this story in the second book of the Bible. It's called Exodus, a story of God's people who are in the wilderness. And by the way, the wilderness is a great way to talk about an experience that is disorienting or something that exposes us, because the wilderness exposes the scaffolding that we have and just blows it apart. And if anything has blown apart our conceptions of time and our conceptions of space and balance, it's this pandemic. Anyway, there's a story about the people of Israel. They're in the wilderness. They have just been freed from 400 years of slavery to the Pharaoh in Egypt. And they get into this desert, and all of a sudden they start to wonder about where their food's going to come from. God provides manna, these wafers that are sweet, taste like honey, and just appear every morning. Every morning, that is, except the seventh day, the Sabbath. And the Bible has this great little story about people collecting the manna as much as they need, and then on the Sabbath day, none appears. But you know what? Some people still go out and try to collect on the Sabbath. Because if you've been enslaved to the Pharaoh in 400 years, how hard would it be to not allow your body to get up and do the thing that you expect it to do? Some of the Israelites were still getting used to this new story, this new invitation that on the seventh day, there is actual rest. You get to cease. You get to simply rest in the presence of God and in God's provision as you eat the manna you collected the day before. And ultimately, that's our invitation today. Because Sabbath is this invitation into a new story, God's story. We've been given a new identity in the triune God of grace. And it is in this story that we are to rest. Because if we're still working on the assumption and finding our identity in the assumption that we are what we do, and we have started to label ourselves essential, non-essential, we've allowed ourselves to push through our physical, emotional, or spiritual limits in order to get another shift in, or we have allowed ourselves to just bleed every day into one continuous line of time, we are feeding into all of those destructive stories. But God stands with us in the wilderness moments of this pandemic and invites us into another story, a story of belonging, a story that invites us to find rest and balance in life. So if you're working a shift and a challenging ICU maybe at a hospital, the invitation for you is to know that in all of those shifts, there is an invitation of God to rest, to take a break, that you still need to stop and allow God to speak to you. And for those of us that have allowed a day to become the next day, to become the next day, to become the next day, God invites us and challenges us to mark our time differently, to create the spaces that we can engage well with who God is and who God is calling us to be. Now you might be asking, that's all fine, but how might we do that? Well, I'm pleased to tell you that we have some suggestions coming up in the coming videos, and we hope you stick around and engage with us as we unpack that. But in the meantime, know this: you are loved and created by a God who is full of grace and has given you every good gift that you need in this world. And so, knowing that God has imprinted you with that divine image, given you what you need, also know that God has given you the need and the desire to cease. You're not what you do. You're not what you have, and you're not what others say about you. You belong to a loving God who invites you to rest in God's presence and with God to continue to find and work for our wholeness, grace, and peace.